December 21st, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103. All 243 passengers and 16 crew on the jet perish instantly. The plane is a Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas. It departs London's Heathrow Airport, bound for New York. Among the 259 people on board are students returning home for the holidays, business travelers, and entire families. 190 of them American citizens. But less than 40 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft cruises at 31,000 feet over the Scottish countryside, it vanishes from radar. A thunderous explosion shatters the calm of the night. In the town of Lockerbie below, residents reel in shock as fiery debris rains down over a vast area. The wreckage of Pan Am 103 plummets onto homes, engulfing entire blocks in flames. All 243 passengers and 16 crew on the jet perish instantly. And on the ground, 11 residents of Lockerbie lose their lives, with a total of 270 men, women and children killed. The Lockerbie bombing becomes the deadliest terrorist attack in British history. It is an unthinkable tragedy that horrifies the world and sets in motion one of the largest international investigations ever undertaken. We chronicle the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing, from the events leading up to the disaster and the painstaking forensic hunt for clues, to the quest for justice that ensnared Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi and reshaped global politics. Stay with us as we delve into how the bombing was executed, how investigators cracked the case, and the decades-long fallout that followed. Just after 7 p.m. on December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 is leveling off for its transatlantic journey. Without warning, a bomb detonates in the forward cargo hold. In an instant, the 747 is torn apart mid-air. Aviation experts later determine the front section of the fuselage separated immediately, causing a catastrophic breakup. The explosion's force and the sudden decompression ensure that none on board survive the next moments. Wreckage from the disintegrating jumbo jet is strewn across 845 square miles of southern Scotland. The heaviest pieces of the aircraft, including engines and sections of fuselage, slam into Lockerbie's residential areas at terrifying speed. One large section gouges a crater in Sherwood Crescent, obliterating several houses and igniting an inferno. Other fragments scatter over farms and fields. The scene is one of utter devastation. Within hours, emergency crews in local villages converge in the cold winter darkness to search for survivors, though it soon becomes clear there are none. The scale of the crash site is immense. By some measures, the largest crime scene in history. Fires burn into the night as ambulances, police and military units coordinate recovery of victims. Over the coming days, the world learns of the lives cut short. Vigils and memorials are held on both sides of the Atlantic. Amid the grief, one urgent question dominates. What caused the plane to explode? Suspicion quickly turns to sabotage, a bomb on board, and an intensive, and in this time, the plane continues to put it sightly, the more often the air is clear and cold. From the outset, British and American authorities treat Lockerbie as a criminal massacre rather than an accident. Scottish police from Dumfries and Galloway team up with agents from the US FBI, deploying unprecedented resources in a joint investigation. More than 5,000 personnel comb the countryside for evidence, braving brutal winter weather. They painstakingly retrieve 319 tons of wreckage, virtually the entire aircraft, along with thousands of fragments of luggage, clothing, and personal effects. Each recovered piece is tagged and analyzed. Forensic teams even scour sheep pastures and rivers by hand, determined to find any clue that could identify who carried out this atrocity. Investigators will ultimately interview over 10,000 individuals across 16 countries, in their quest for answers. Early findings are grim, but conclusive. Traces of high explosive, later identified as PTN, a component of Syntex, are detected on aircraft debris, confirming that a bomb brought down the plane. The positioning of fractured metal frames indicates the bomb was likely hidden in baggage in the forward cargo hold. Attention turns to a shredded suitcase that investigators believe housed the device. Critical evidence soon emerges. In a field 25 miles from Lockerbie, a forensic expert picks up a singed piece of an electronic circuit board no larger than a fingernail, embedded in a fragment of charred shirt. This tiny piece of circuitry, almost lost in the vast debris field, proves to be the investigative breakthrough the team needs. Upon laboratory analysis, the fragment is identified as part of a timer device. Specifically, it matches a circuit from an electronic timer known as MST-13, a model manufactured by a Swiss company, MEBO, and reportedly sold in the 1980s to Libyan intelligence agents. This discovery shifts the focus firmly toward Libya. Investigators also determine the bomb had likely been concealed within a Toshiba radio cassette player inside the suitcase, a known method used in prior terror plots. Meanwhile, another clue comes from painstaking reassembly of clothing found in the suitcase. Labels on charred cloth lead police to a clothing shop in Malta. The shopkeeper, Tony Gauci, recalls a man who bought those items weeks before the bombing, a man who later tentatively identifies as having a Libyan appearance and accent. Airline records reveal an unaccompanied suitcase was sent from Malta's Lucca airport on December 21st, transferred in Frankfurt onto the ill-fated Pan Am 103's feeder flight. Piece by piece, the investigators reconstruct the bomb's journey. It likely originated in Malta, hidden in a suitcase containing clothes from Gauci's shop, then traveled on flights to Frankfurt and London, where it was loaded into Pan Am 103's cargo hold. The timer's Libyan connection and the Malta link point to a startling conclusion. The bombing was not the work of a lone extremist or a rogue group, but an operation orchestrated by Libyan intelligence. The suspects emerge. By 1990, the investigation has zeroed in on two particular Libyan nationals suspected of involvement: Abdelbasset Ali al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer purportedly head of security for Libyan Arab Airlines, and Lemine Khalifa Fima, the station manager for Libyan Arab Airlines in Malta. Megrahi had traveled under an alias through Malta on the day the bag was sent, and Fima was believed to have facilitated the luggage's transfer at Lucca Airport. After compiling voluminous evidence, from the timer fragment linkage to Libya to records of the far-flying path of self-consciousness, often done by the others, and Gauci's identification of Megrahi as the clothing buyer, British and US prosecutors formally charged the two Libyans in November 1991. Scotland issues warrants for their arrest on 270 counts of murder, one for each life lost. The indictments name Libya's intelligence service as responsible for the plot, but getting hold of the accused men is another matter entirely. At the time, Muammar Gaddafi, Libya's longtime ruler, adamantly refuses to hand over Megrahi or Fima. Gaddafi's regime is internationally notorious, linked to other terror incidents in the 1980s, and it defiantly rejects the jurisdiction of a US or UK court. For years, a tense standoff ensues. In 1992, the United Nations Security Council imposes sanctions on Libya to pressure Gaddafi to surrender the suspects. These sanctions, backed by the US and UK, include an air travel embargo and freezing of Libyan assets, isolating the country diplomatically and economically. Still, Gaddafi initially remains obstinate, proclaiming Libya's innocence and condemning what he calls Western bullying. Behind the scenes, negotiations carry on intermittently, with intermediaries, including South African President Nelson Mandela and Saudi diplomats, trying to broker a solution. The victims' families, meanwhile, campaign relentlessly for justice. Years pass with no resolution. It will take nearly a decade of international pressure before a breakthrough occurs. By 1998, Libya signals a willingness to cooperate if a trial can be held in a neutral country. Finally, in April 1999, in a high-stakes diplomatic compromise, Colonel Gaddafi hands over Megrahi and Fima to Scottish authorities for trial in the Netherlands, a neutral location agreed upon by all sides. The world watches as the two accused are flown to a former US airbase in Camp Zeist, the Netherlands, to face justice under Scottish law. One suitcase, a single circuit board, and a trail of clues spanning continents. After years of painstaking investigation, authorities believe they've identified the men who planted the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103. When Muammar Gaddafi agreed to hand over the two Lockerbie bombing suspects in April 1999, the world called it a breakthrough. After more than a decade of silence, evasion, and global pressure, Libya had finally taken the first step toward accountability. Or so it seemed. Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and Lamin Fima were delivered into custody under a unique legal arrangement, tried under Scottish law in a neutral court in the Netherlands. In exchange, the United Nations suspended its sanctions against Libya. But this concession was not surrender. It was a calculated maneuver in a much broader political game. For Gaddafi, terrorism had always been part of a strategy. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Libya's foreign policy was shaped by confrontation with the West, and Gaddafi positioned himself as a revolutionary figure, opposing imperialism, Zionism, and colonial influence across Africa and the Middle East. His regime funded armed movements, sheltered fugitives, and was linked to a series of international bombings. The destruction of Pan Am Flight 103, in this context, fit a long-standing pattern: violence as a tool of diplomacy. When Libya felt marginalized, it retaliated, not just with rhetoric, but with explosive consequences. The Lockerbie bombing was interpreted by many as an act of retaliation, a message following Western airstrikes on Tripoli in 1986, and part of Libya's wider effort to reassert control over its international standing. But when global sanctions froze Libyan assets, grounded flights, and paralyzed trade, the cost of resistance grew unsustainable. Throughout the 1990s, Libya faced severe economic strain. Gaddafi knew he could not outlast the West indefinitely. Still, he refused to concede guilt. Libya never acknowledged that the bombing of Pan Am 103 had been planned at the highest levels. Gaddafi rejected demands for extradition for years, insisting that the suspects would not receive a fair trial in the UK or US. It was only under mounting diplomatic and economic pressure that he relented, allowing a neutral trial in the Netherlands under Scottish jurisdiction. But this cooperation came at a price. The suspects were surrendered, but Gaddafi kept his narrative intact. Once the suspects were in custody, the international community responded. UN sanctions were suspended. Diplomatic overtures followed. Western companies resumed interest in Libyan oil and infrastructure projects. Slowly, Libya began to re-emerge on the global stage. This was Gaddafi's intended outcome: to trade controlled concessions for restored access to global markets, without publicly admitting wrongdoing. The turning point came in 2003. Facing continued isolation, Gaddafi's government offered financial compensation to the families of the Lockerbie victims. The deal was extraordinary, roughly 10 million per victim, but would not admit criminal guilt. The payments were tied to political conditions. Partial payments were to be released with the lifting of UN sanctions, further installments tied to the end of US trade restrictions, and final sums upon removal from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. It was a legal settlement, not a confession. The framing was deliberate. Libya accepted responsibility for the actions of its officials, without implicating its head of state or intelligence leadership. Gaddafi managed to protect his regime's image while satisfying the formal demands of international diplomacy. In effect, Libya paid for peace. The Lockerbie bombing had been acknowledged, but never fully owned. This move opened the door for Libya's reintegration. The West responded favorably. Diplomatic relations were restored. Libya's disarmament of its weapons of mass destruction programs, announced later that year, accelerated the process. For the first time in decades, Gaddafi was no longer an international outcast. He began hosting African summits, promoting Pan-African unity, and positioning Libya as a key player in continental politics. In 2009, he was even elected chair of the African Union. But the Lockerbie bombing remained unresolved in the eyes of many. At the 2001 trial at Camp Zeist, only one suspect, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, was convicted. The court concluded that the bombing had been carried out by Libyan intelligence, but stopped short of identifying higher-level officials. Kimo was acquitted. The judges pointed clearly to Libyan state responsibility, but no further charges were brought against senior figures in the regime. Inside Libya, Gaddafi retained control over the narrative. The regime hailed the acquittal of one suspect as vindication and condemned the conviction of Megrahi as politically motivated. Megrahi remained in prison in Scotland, filing appeals and maintaining his innocence. Publicly, Libya continued to deny that the government had ordered the bombing. Privately, Gaddafi focused on reshaping his international relationships. Gaddafi's pivot from rogue actor to international partner was complete, but it was achieved without transparency, accountability, or truth. The Lockerbie victims' families had received money, but not full justice. The story took another turn in 2009. After serving 8 years of prison, Megrahi was released by the Scottish government on compassionate grounds due to terminal illness. He returned to Libya to a hero's welcome. The decision sparked outrage across the UK and US, with many accusing both governments of prioritizing economic interests over justice. Megrahi lived for nearly 3 more years before his death in 2012. He remained the only person ever convicted in connection to the Lockerbie bombing. As the Arab Spring swept through North Africa in 2011, Libya exploded into civil unrest. After months of violent clashes, Muammar Gaddafi's regime collapsed. He was captured and killed by rebel forces in October 2011. With his death, new evidence and testimonies began to surface. Former Libyan officials began speaking out. Intelligence officers who had worked under the regime claimed that Gaddafi had personally approved the Lockerbie bombing. They named key figures within the Libyan intelligence apparatus. They identified the chain of command. For the first time, claims emerged directly implicating the dictator himself. One name resurfaced: Abu Aguila Mohammed Massoud, a former Libyan bomb technician. According to multiple reports, Massoud had built the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103. In 2020, the United States formally charged him. In 2022, Massoud was transferred into American custody. He now awaits trial in the US for his alleged role in the Lockerbie bombing. More than 3 decades after the attack, the full truth may still be emerging. The evidence increasingly points to a state-sponsored act of terrorism carried out under Gaddafi's direction. Yet the man who led Libya for 42 years never stood trial, never faced cross-examination, and never admitted guilt. His government paid billions, but maintained its denial. The Lockerbie bombing is not only a story of international justice, it is a case study in authoritarian strategy. Gaddafi used terrorism as leverage, diplomacy as delay, and financial settlements as shields. He manipulated international law to protect his regime while projecting strength on the African stage. He championed African unity while using state power to carry out acts of global violence. He was a paradox, both liberator and oppressor, visionary and villain. Today, Libya is still reckoning with that legacy. The nation remains divided. Its justice system is fragmented. Key officials from the Gaddafi era remain unprosecuted for Lockerbie. But the victims are not forgotten, and the pursuit of truth has not ended. Pan Am Flight 103 was not just the target of a terrorist bomb. It was the centerpiece of a decades-long struggle between a state determined to assert its power and an international community demanding accountability. In the end, Muammar Gaddafi showed how far a dictator could go to rewrite the narrative, but also how far the world would go to reveal the truth. This is the legacy of Lockerbie, and it is still unfolding.